Hello and welcome to another episode of Quarantine the Fulbrighters, where we bring you Fulbrighters who've been quarantined, much like you have. These are some of the brightest minds that we have, and we have somebody very special whose work I've admired for years at this point. Samar Naqvi is here with us. How are you doing, Samar?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. For people who have not been blessed about knowing Samar Naqvi and the work she does, she's the Chief Operating Officer at the Karachi Down Syndrome Program, and she has a Fulbright Master's from New York University. I have a Fulbright Master's from New York, but not from New York University because I'm not as smart as Samar, whose Master's is in Applied Psychology, Human Development, and Social Intervention. So, first question, Samar, what is this Master's which has all three?
The masters is actually an interesting concoction. It was the first time that they were launching it. It was a hybrid between an educational psychology, applied psychology, and a sociology-based degree. And they started it out for the first. So we were the first batch that actually came out of this program, and it was a very interesting mix because it had elements of psychology, a lot of elements of research, um, and work around grassroots, uh, and sociology, anthropology. So there was, it sort of lended itself very easily to the social development
Hmm.
sector that now work for.
What was your bachelor's in? Because for you to go and do a master's in something that combines so many different fields, I'm just curious as to what you had done before you went.
So I was a business major. I was halfway through an MBA actually when I got my Fulbright, and I moved immediately because the thing was that I always wanted to do something of this nature. It was just that I couldn't find the institution or a degree in the country that would allow me to pursue such a great mix of studies, right?
So
So which is why I moved.
I get this question all the time as somebody who studied law and then did my master's in theater, again on a Fulbright. But how did you manage to switch? Because if you were halfway through your MBA, I'm assuming your experience was also towards the business side as opposed to psychology or human intervention.
So back then, there wasn't an essential need for work experience before you got your Fulbright. So I was studying all the way through. Um, and again, since I had the intention of wanting to study sociology and wanting to
Mm.
work on mental health, the social development in the country, it I was very lucky to get it. Um, but the intent was very pure, and um, I believe like if I hadn't gotten the degree, I don't know where I would have been. I'm
Mm.
so glad I did because for over 9 years now, I've just been working on in the social development sector.
I think at this point, Pakistan is glad that you did this degree because if we look at your resume and the things you've done, we started the interview chronologically. Let's just stick to that. So after coming back, did you join Now PDP immediately?
No, I worked at the Aman Foundation for 2 years, and then now PDP came around. So I worked there over 5 years, and now I've been here at the Karachi Down Syndrome Program for over 2 years now.
So for people who might not know, we have a broad range of people who listen to this podcast, including Fulbrighters and the general audience. Uh, it's a word that we hear a lot, Down syndrome, but people might not know exactly what it is. So can you please tell them?
Yes. So Down syndrome is actually classified under intellectual impairments. However, it is a genetic condition that is caused by an extra copy in the 21st chromosome. So a human body is made up of multiple cells, right? And each cell has 23 pairs of chromosomes. When there is an extra copy in the 21st pair, it means that a person will be born with Down syndrome. What it does is that it leads to certain developmental delays and intellectual delays in a child. However, given the right intervention at the right time, so early on, first 1,000 days of a child with Down syndrome are extremely crucial. So if they receive early intervention during that time, the outcomes and their developmental milestones can be reached almost at par with their typically developing peers.
So is that what the work at KDSB is focused on?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I could talk a little bit more about the work that we do, because it's always been quite a complicated thing to explain to people as to the sort of work we do. Lots of people consider the Karachi Down Syndrome Program an educational institute. Others call it an NGO. The rest of them call it a therapy clinic. Some say we work in healthcare, um, or skills development for a child, or that we're a family support group, but in actuality we're like a mix of everything. We're a one-stop solution for any family that has a child with Down syndrome. We are serving over 1,000 families of children with Down syndrome now after 5 years of work. And what we essentially act like is a kashti. So a kashti is a boat, and the Karachi Down syndrome is that boat that takes a family from one space to another. And even though the waters might be rough sometimes and there might be calm waters sometimes, but we tell the families that we're here with them and their child is also going to have a beautiful life, and we're going to be there in this beautiful journey that they're going to have. And interestingly enough, each of the letters, each of the alphabets of Kashti stand for each of our areas of service. So K in Kashti stands for Khandani Sahara, which is family support,
Hmm.
where we provide emotional, financial, and informational support to our families who have children with Down syndrome. The A of Kashti means Agahi, which means awareness in English. And we do a number of exercises, a number of campaigns to spread inclusivity in society and acceptance for children and individuals with Down syndrome. The S in Kashti stands for Sehat, which means healthcare. We partner up with the best hospitals in the city such that our individuals with Down syndrome can get subsidized and specialized Down syndrome related healthcare. Um, the H in Kashti stands for Hunar, which means skills development. And skills development are multiple programs run for helping our individuals develop handicrafts, which we sell on their behalf, and 100% of the proceeds go to them so that they get a sense of independence and contribution as well. The T in Kashti stands for Talim, which means education. So again, a few programs that we have in education run such that children with Down syndrome can study in inclusive partner schools alongside their typically developing peers. And the I in Kashti stands for Ibtidai Bunyad, which means early childhood intervention, where our occupational, physical, and speech language therapy clinics run for children between the ages of 0 to 7 so that they can reach their developmental milestones. So in its entirety, KDSP acts like that kashti that's going to help families go from one space to another. Yeah,
It's beautiful
we're the
how
boat.
things work out. The fact that NYU launched such a unique program and you were the first batch, and now the work that you're doing at KDSB actually combines all those fields. So for them to find somebody like you who actually has expertise in all these fields and can put it all together, it's phenomenal. And especially in a field or a category that not a lot of attention is paid at. And it's so interesting that you talked about families to begin with, because as important as early intervention is, maybe sometimes the biggest struggle we face as a society is intervention with the families, um, or making them understand, making them aware. uh, how is that interaction like? Is there hopelessness from the parents? um, is it viewed at within the lens of religion? And what do those conversations end up looking like?
So it's a mix of all of those things that you mentioned, and it all does start from the families, right? So our entire essence was we started out as a family support group.
Mm.
So this is where a number of parents got together and realized that they're the ones who will have to push the mandate. They're the ones who are going to have to carry this mantle, because they're going to be the biggest advocates and biggest ambassadors for their children. So the moment they move from the space of helplessness, despair, despondence, through the support that they get through the Kashti, or the support that they are now gathering because the community of sorts has been built out with other parents and the other support that they're getting, um, they are now able to, at least the parents who are registered with us are now able to be out there in the society, accepting their child, celebrating their child, introducing their child to everybody. Whereas previously this was considered like um, a burden. A child with Down syndrome was possibly hidden inside the houses. Nobody was proud. And now we're reaching a stage where there is acceptance, at least within these families that have a platform, uh, at least there. So we're starting out somewhere.
And what are your thoughts about the bigger battle? If there's acceptance within the families and these support groups exist, which is absolutely beautiful, but in terms of the society at large, and we move on to the A of the Kashti, how's the agai and the awareness? Is how big of a struggle is that, and how steep is that uphill climb?
You know, uh, I mean, we could talk endlessly around how much of a need for awareness is still there, because absolutely we haven't even touched the surface. There is so much that can still be done. There's so many layers to this. So like you said, some people view it with a certain lens of pity, sympathy,
Yeah.
whereas others would review it from a religious perspective. Perhaps others might consider it something below them, a superiority power thing. So there's so many factors that are there that sometimes even the people who are working for um, marginalized communities such as us, we need that glimmer of hope. We need to focus on what can is possible, what we are able to achieve if we are to deliver um, top quality service every day, bring our A game every single day. We have to focus on on the awareness that has been created and the possibilities thereon. So yes, while we barely scraped the surface, there's so much that can still be done, not just for individuals with Down syndrome, but
Yeah.
individuals with disabilities in general. 15% of the world's population of persons with disabilities, which means over 30 million people in the country. So so yes, immense need, and so many actors, so many stakeholders can get involved.
You mentioned sympathy as well, and I think this is a discussion that we've had often, but it would be very important to elucidate this for the audience as well. What's the difference between viewing things with sympathy as opposed to empathy?
um, so I mean, like the standard definition is actually and it's interesting because the organization I used to work for, now PDP, the title of it was the Network of Organizations Working for People with Disabilities in Pakistan. Quite a mouthful, but for people with disabilities was the sympathetic way to go about it. Whereas when we change that for to the with, so when we say the network of organizations working with people with disabilities, and
Mhm.
actually having people with disabilities in the employee base, in the people who were the advisors, in the people who were the voice of what was to come thereon, I think that's the change from sympathy to empathy. That is the difference.
I believe it's a native population saying in Canada which says nothing about them without them. So the idea of
Yes.
inclusivity, beyond just giving lip service to that, actually having them have a voice and leading that
Mm.
conversation, not having a voice, because even that makes it sound like you're doing them a favor by giving them a voice. It is their voice to begin with.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
You
But
mentioned,
Chidad,
go for it.
sorry. So I was actually having a discussion with somebody, and we were talking about how who are we to be their voice?
Hmm.
Who nominated us? Who elected us?
Yeah.
How do we know what is best for them? Sure, we read theory. Sure, we read what has happened before and what needs to be done. Um, but it's not them talking, right? And then we go back to the point on awareness, where I sometimes wonder if individuals with disabilities were the only people talking about why it is essential for them to be a part of society and be included, would it have been as relatable and as identifiable for the larger groups? So yes, for a few hours, for a few minutes, they would listen to them and be like, yes, absolutely, they must be. But they would still be in the minority. They would still be that minority. And if more people, like, just like the feminist movement, if men weren't also joining in, then how would it? I wonder if it would be relatable for other men, or would they dismiss it as a women only problem, or like a disability only problem if we weren't a part of it? Because that's also what we're demonstrating, right? Like that's also what we're trying to create. We are creating an inclusive society where all of us talk about what are concerns of the society together,
Hmm.
not one for themselves, but all of us for what is right.
I think the problem comes when the agenda is set without due consciousness paid to the lived experience. Both with the feminist movement and with the disability movement, the thing to be cautious of that it's in the past the agenda has been dictated to them, whether it be men enacting laws for women or men controlling the women's bodies and men being in the seat of power. If there was to be an Aurat March and everybody on stage speaking were men, that would be quite problematic.
Yeah.
So in terms of
Yes.
supporting and amplifying, absolutely. If we
Yes.
don't, who would? If we incorporate that appropriation debate wholeheartedly without actually thinking about the local context, nobody would be speaking about these issues and they wouldn't get attention. So it's not a question of appropriation, but it's a question of not deciding for them, which I think is what people are afraid of.
Hmm. It's the easier thing to do, right? Not deciding for somebody as opposed to really listening to them, understanding what their needs are,
I think, and
or having. Or
that's the
go
problem,
ahead.
right? That's how historically it's been dealt with.
Yes. 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 Even though, like, I mean, we keep going back to, so the needs assessment to the baselining is a crucial element of any sort of programmatic design. So whenever we design programs, whenever we design interventions, it's a community that speaks as to what the need is. So
Mm.
they talk about it. We at KDSP we started out as a family support group. Multiple parents were talking to each other, and then the essential services came around, like healthcare and early childhood intervention. But there were some families who came to us and said, we have 14, 15-year-old children with Down syndrome, and you have nothing for them. What do we do? They never received early intervention, so their developmental milestones haven't been met. They're nonverbal, they have limited fine motor skills. What do we do? And that's when the emergence of our skills development program came around, where these adults who were nonverbal and who couldn't even hold a needle now stitch and make handicrafts that are so beautiful. We sell them on their behalf. They get 100% of the proceeds. They get a sense of empowerment, independence. They're contributing members now, as opposed to us just sitting back and not doing anything, right? Like, because it would have been, if they haven't received early intervention and they're nonverbal, perhaps those outcomes may be limited. But there were possibilities, and the parents came up with it. The parents talked about it.
Absolutely. I think giving people agency, as the old cliche goes, give the man a fish or teach them how to fish. Um,
Hmm.
It's about giving them agency, and unfortunately, a lot of the discourse historically has been viewed from a charitable lens. It's been viewed from a lens of charity, whether it be disability or an intellectual hindrance. It's always viewed from a lens of charity, and as you mentioned, sympathy. Changing that conversation, it's maybe a much harder battle, even when people are coming from a good place. They might cause some harm because the narrative that they're forming maybe seeks to satiate their desire to be pious, but does little for the community themselves. What's your take on how marginalized communities are generally dealt with in Pakistan, and what the conversation around them is?
So I mean, like we spoke about how they're dealt with. I mean, the one thing that is a conversation all around, and again, this isn't something that has drastically changed over these 8-9 years that I've been working in this sector. Um, but it's a conversation, right? Like the first word that comes to people's mind when we ask them,
Mm,
um, what's the first word that comes to your mind when we say disability? Um, and they say bichari, a bichara or a bichari, like a poor soul, or like somebody who has no agency, or you know. And that's pretty much how we treat marginalized communities, because this is how we this is our worldview, this is our lens, the way we are viewing vulnerable groups. And and what it does is that this word and this the way we view it is how we treat marginalized communities as well. And in turn, what we do is we start doing things for them.
mm,
We're people who are trying to do it out of a in our own way, a good sort of thing that we're doing, right? Like we're helping somebody out. But but what it builds out, and this is research that talks about, there's a British Council research that talks about this, but uh, it, it says that it builds out learned helplessness in individuals with disabilities, where when they grow up,
mm.
they do really feel like they can't do a certain something, whereas they might really be capable of doing that, but it's just that it is being done for them. So now they have acquired this learned helplessness because of how we are treating them, because of how we are viewing them. It's all language perspective based, the intent.
So it's just phenomenal, the work that you're doing and all the organizations that you worked at. There are a lot of people listening who might be working with other organizations which unknowingly may be falling into some of these traps. Is there any advice or a formula that you can give them so that they can review what they're doing, or how they can better build their own communities?
So so again, like it puts that's a difficult question, because it puts me in that position where I am supposed to tell them what is best,
But
and
you're
I
telling
often
you're telling other CEOs. You're not telling people from the communities. You're actually talking to your community, which is chief operating
shared
officer.
experiences. So instead of saying advice, I'd probably say what works for me. What works for me is a few things. I feel like one, always having those conversations with the direct beneficiaries.
Mm,
So regardless of where you are in your role, and in terms of um, in terms of how the responsibilities of an organization and running it, not, but always being connected, directly connected with the beneficiaries, because they're going to be able to give insight that you might be missing out on. And 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 two, just an extension of that is listening, just like stopping, pausing, understanding, listening. Listening works with everybody. There's a lot of people who have so many experiences. People are living through a lot, and specifically
mm,
this year, it's been incredibly challenging. And the way we've fared is primarily because we've built out a culture where we try to listen to each other. We have the time sort of isolated for not just us to listen to families and families to listen to each other, arranging support groups, but also for the employees, for them having the opportunity to communicate, to share, unjudged, confidential, share.
Um, I'm just stumped at what to ask next, because we're also running out of time. There are probably 20 million things I could talk to you about, because you're a woman of many talents. Apart from all of this, you're also a therapist. So can we get a quick advice on any mental health tips during COVID as well, how you've coped with your quarantine, and how people who are listening might be able to?
Okay, again, advice. So
Shared
it's
experience,
like I said,
things that have things that have
this
worked for you.
so things that have worked. Okay, so so during this time, I got an unlimited number of calls and messages, um, for people who are seeking therapy,
Hmm.
and I have very limited time to give, considering that I work at the Karachi Down Syndrome Program full time, and just a few hours left after the day ends to even deliver therapy. And in my need to want to be there for people, I said yes to a lot more clients. I started saying, so I opened up, if the frontline workers wanted therapy as well, so they were recruiting some therapists for there. I gave a few hours there, and a few months down the line, with trying to manage um, an organization and its emotions, the beneficiaries that I was working with, and the clients, it was an incredible challenge for me, and I was breaking down. And that's when I realized that there is that importance of self-care that has to come in. So specifically when one is doing work that one might not realize but is taking an emotional toll,
Hmm.
and one only has a certain level of capacity, whereas while we might be overestimating our capacities, we also have to keep tabs on where we are and lend some compassion to ourselves as well. So over this period of time, I actually learned that um, that that element had to be brought back for me to function.
It's so interesting what experiences teach us. Probably 5 years ago, you were telling people you can't pour from an empty cup, but it's now that you truly realize, now that you lived that experience, that you cannot pour from an empty cup.
I'm
Uh,
actually guilty of this, Shazad. I might make this mistake again. I might take up more again, thinking I have more capacity, misunderstanding my
how
own
how much
capacity.
of this perspective that you have as somebody who had studied business, how much of this perspective is something that you always had or had a bent towards, or how much of it is the learning and the cultural exposure in the US that has shaped your perspective on things?
Um, it would be hard to give a division, but I think a lot has to do with the education that I had. A lot had to do, and not just the masters and the degree that I did, but
Mm.
just the life in New York. Um, so for largely my entire life, so I was the youngest, quite pampered, had things done for me, very, very, very dependent.
Mm.
Nothing I would do would be would I wouldn't be able to say this was my own. Right? Even the choice of doing an MBA was primarily because, oh, my brother went to Harvard Business School, so I'm supposed to also take the same route, right? Um, it was only when I went to New York, and life changed completely, from a life of complete dependence to a life of complete independence. um, if you don't do your laundry is not going to be done. If you don't get yourself food, it's not going to come to you. And that sort of shift um, helped me explore and identify so many various aspects of myself. I used to question whether these are little tiny things that occurred to me earlier because I learned this from my parents, or is it really me? And by being away from the family and finding home in a place that I never thought I could even survive in, um, was when I discovered so much about myself and realized some of those elements were actually me, and the rest of them I could shed away. A huge part has to be like the interactions, the friends, the the family that I actually found in New York. They're still there everywhere, like across the world, and they're really family.
Found your tribe. I sound like a broken record at this point, but I keep repeating. Again, it's probably the most cliched thing to say, but it's the Fulbright experience. It's the experience as opposed to just the degree. But if we are to talk specifically about the degree, have you managed to replicate some of the learning environment or some of the ideas that you learned over there in your work? Or how does that educate? How does the degree itself educate your work?
I'd like to think so. I mean, this I can very almost confident. I say things, few things with such confidence, but I feel like absolutely the learning that I had during that time, it's helped me because I'm a very structure based, very discipline based person, and the tools that I actually got during the education were around monitoring, learning, evaluation systems, how to take a problem from the grassroots and then eventually write a grant for it, be able to access funding for it so that you can carry it out from its stages of research to a complete learning, so implementation, all of the things in design that come in. And 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 I feel like a lot I borrowed a lot. I'm still in touch with some of my professors and keep bouncing ideas off of them. And they're just so wonderful to want to help out. But I also realized that, there's so much potential in Pakistan. We're a very resilient bunch. We're so resilient. We go on. I sometimes go every year. There's a UN based conference on disabilities, and even last year I went and I was talking about the disability landscape in Pakistan, in a South Asian based panel, and there's so many people who came to me to talk about, how they completely were blown away by the sort of work that is happening in the country, and that we're continuing on despite the challenges. We're not giving up.
I think it's whether a girl doing business who is thrusted into New York, whether it be people that we have only viewed from a lens of sympathy, or whether it be the country itself. The more we believe in ourselves, the more we believe in the human agency and the human will, the more people will surprise you of what they can achieve and what they can manage. But still, their capacity is limited. So, Samir, please, we need you. I think the work that you're doing has benefited a lot of people, even if you might not see it as noble as it truly is. So let me be somebody to say it. Thank you so much for everything that you do. And thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me, and always a pleasure talking to you as well. We could
And,
go on endlessly.
absolutely. We would love to have you back again for season 3, maybe. Thank you so much, Summer, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back again next week with another Fulbrighter on quarantine with Fulbrighters. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.